I was thinking about the opportunity to bring Ruth and Allison together for a conversation on women's leadership. What struck me was that both are powerful thinkers and inspiring people who put their ideas into action. Both of them took on jobs in challenging institutional environments in the early 80s. I didn't know this till I started checking dates and preparing for this talk, that they both started their careers roughly at the same time. The early 80s was a tricky time to do things. A lot of pressure on institutions of higher education to undergo very serious reforms at that point, and there were lots of pressure on gender issues, on issues of race and racial relations on campuses, so that there were a lot of things converging at that time. In practice, their visions extended far beyond their official titles. Over their careers, both brought their work to larger agendas for change and faced resistance. There can be no doubt that Ruth and Allison are powerful and articulate leaders who have successfully engaged in important projects of institutional change. So are we ready? Okay, we're ready. Yeah, we're ready. Okay, Ruth and Allison. Okay, so I want to know, when did you discover in yourself this need to build and transform institutions? Was that hardwired? Was it something that you just discovered along the way? Was it something that grew on you? Did you feel compelled? Did you bring larger values to institutions, or a larger vision of social change that you couldn't shed? You just came with you. How did that all start? Ruth, why don't you start us?
Well, I think it's probably the case that one can't grow up in the South, in the rural South, reviled and discriminated against without seeing that something's wrong. So probably as a child, I understood that something needed to be done. And of course, I didn't know what exactly, but I knew even then that finding a way to deal with discrimination and bias of all kinds and inequality in society had to be a part of my life somehow. But in truth, I spent my time mostly studying, and it was not until perhaps my first job that I actually had a chance to do something concrete. So my very first job as an assistant professor of French, I decided that everybody in my department, all the senior faculty, they were all teaching French wrong. And so I don't know what came over me, but I decided that I was going to reform teaching in my department. And I set about to do it. So I went from office to office, talking with all of the faculty and saying, you know, don't you think we could do better? And shouldn't we try to coordinate our teaching and give our students a better experience? And so I think they thought I was a bit odd. And so they tolerated it somehow, which I can never understand, the most junior person in the department. And so that was the first time I really had a chance to dig my hands in and to say, this needs to be fixed, and maybe I'm the person to do it. And I actually, I started there, and I just never stopped. I always found something that seemed to me to warrant addressing. And I never liked the idea, perhaps from my childhood, of seeing all the people who stood by and watched discrimination for years and never thought to do anything about it. And I think somehow the idea that there were problems to be addressed and that people needed to embrace the task of solving them, it was always with me somehow from the time that I was a child. And as soon as I got a chance to do something, I actually did it. So I moved from there. So I was assistant professor for a couple of years, and then the dean came to me and said, would you become an assistant dean? This is 2 years into being a professor. So it was pretty clear from the outset that I was inveterately, I suppose, a fixer of something. And I just started doing that work and continued it actually from that time on. So from the earliest time when I had my first job, I guess I started doing that.
That's great. Allison?
First, let me say what an honor it is to be at Brown and what an honor it is to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Pembroke Center. Thank you, Kay. And what an honor it is to be with Ruth Simmons, who is one of the great leaders of American higher education. I spent some time thinking about this question. Kay had posed it to us a while ago, and I was asking friends of mine, well, when did I start thinking about institutional building? And somebody reminded me I was in student government, and that was important. But really, if I'm totally honest, here's the true story. My mother was a school teacher in the New York City public schools, and my father wrote comic books. Superman, Batman, Archie, Betty and Veronica. And they were an interesting couple, I have to say. And I am an only child. And when my father wasn't making enough money, and my mother was worried about how everything would come together, they decided to start a day camp in the backyard. I was 9. You'd think I'd get to be a kid and sort of go to the day camp. No, no, no. We had a family business, and it was an institution. And at age 9, my job was to tie the shoes of the younger kids and be a part of this family business. And as it turned out, I believe now that I was one of those people who started out thinking that organizations and institutions mattered. And the name of the day camp, and this is the part that interests me the most given what Ruth said about social justice. My mother taught in a public school in Queens and loved her kids. And her kids were very much working class and lower middle class kids in the 50s and 60s. So she was trying to figure out how these kids could get a day camp experience because their parents, often both parents, were working. So are you ready for this at Brown? She called this day camp Ivy League Day Camp.
That's great.
And because of that, it had a kind of social mobility patina that never left me. Fast forward, I was a junior at Vassar when Martin Luther King was killed. I was president of student government. We marched down the streets of Poughkeepsie, and our most important question was, where was Vassar? Where was urban studies? Where was black studies? And from then on, it seemed to me that I also, like Ruth, thought something had to be changed in American higher education. So when I graduated, I went to Columbia as a graduate student, but I started teaching right away in a community college on Staten Island. And I'll leave it at that. But it's the same impulse. You go to an institution, you understand that the institution has aspirations and values, and then you try very hard to make it live up to those aspirations and values.
I don't know if I ever told you the story, Allison, that I almost got kicked out of college because when I got to Dillard, which is a Methodist school, they had required chapel. And I was enraged by this because I thought it was so unfair. And I asked myself, but what about Jewish people? What about Catholics? How could you require them to go to chapel? And so I decided that I had to protest and not go to chapel. And so, of course, there were no Jewish students there at all. And there were no Catholic students there at all. But it just seemed to me that institutionally, that was just had to be the wrong approach. And so the university was very upset with me. And they wrote to my family saying that I was going to be kicked out of school. And in fact, at the time that I was preparing to graduate from college, this resurfaced again, and they said I couldn't graduate because I had failed to complete the required number of chapels. And the only thing that saved me, actually, was the fact that I got a Danforth Fellowship and a Fulbright. And there was no way to announce that without letting me graduate. So that's how I graduated.
Ruth's being so honest about that story leads me to an interesting story about Vassar. We were in the late 60s. There was a kind of movement afoot. Never trust anybody over 30. And so in 1970, when I was 23, I was put on the Vassar Board of Trustees to represent the youth culture. By the way, it was pretty interesting. The only thing I remember that I had to do was start drinking because they had a liquor fee that all the trustees had to pay, so the college didn't have to pay it. So I started to drink scotch. Anyway, most important to Ruth's story, which I'm happy to tell, and I hope no one here remembers those days, but Vassar had a very distinguished board. There was, I believe, a Rothschild on that board a couple of years before I was on it, but I was the first Jew to be on that board, who was not only young, and there was only one African American on that board. Her name was Marion Gray Secundi. Her brother, Bill Gray, was head of UNCF. So the college invites the trustees to campus, and we usually get to stay in the alumni house, and everybody got their own room except for Marion Gray Secundi and me. We roomed together.
I'm interested. So let's fast forward past your youth into the moment where you're actually running institutions, and into the moment where the stakes are high because you have to make sure your institutions are running, but you also have this broader internalized vision that other things have to change so that you pass, it's this excess, it's this mandate that you feel that may not necessarily have been always a part of your job. And so I'm very interested in the institutional responses that you receive as you explore the possibility of finding what kinds of changes would make a difference in higher education.
Or even what kind of changes might be tolerated.
Okay, that's right. So the difference between what the changes are that that's exactly right, that you felt compelled to explore, and what institutions tolerated, and what you did with the tension between those two.
All right. I mentioned my first job while I was a graduate student was at Staten Island Community College. And I have to say that this was in the era where the City University of New York really transformed itself, largely because of political protest that CUNY, that university, which had many different campuses, did not have a student body that began to reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of New York City. So my first teaching job was in a trailer in a parking lot on Staten Island. And I realized right from the get-go that there were real issues about resource allocations for community colleges and for community college students. So I think I got politicized in that experience, as well as worrying about women students there who were falling between the cracks and were not getting anything that even remotely spoke to them as human beings. And so the first thing, and this was the first generalization I wanted to make about how people saw women's leadership. It was perfectly fine for us to worry about women so long as it was put in a corner. So my initial leadership was around the creation of a women's studies program at a community college, which hadn't had one before. What's interesting to me is that it happened again when I joined the Ford Foundation as a very young program officer. And the way I could express leadership, and in fact, the way eventually the person who became my boss, Susan Beresford, who became president of Ford, expressed her leadership when she was there, was starting from an interest in women. And what's really interesting is how does that leading from the margins actually, and leading from a kind of group understanding, translate into a more transformative agenda for the whole institution. But my first generalization about this is, for many women, people will let us take the leadership of something so long as they think it can be, I'm going to call it, sort of marginalized or ghettoized or be responsive, but not necessarily move it into the mainstream. And for me, that was the great agenda, both at the community college and at the Ford Foundation.
So when you got further in the Ford Foundation, how did that situation change? Because the title, your last title that I have, is just extraordinary.
I made it up, actually. Now, actually, that's a good story. First of all, how does it change? Well, I had a woman president. The first ever woman president of the Ford Foundation turned out to be the person who enabled me to be a vice president. And Spellman has this expression, I learned it last year, lifting as we climb. I think that's it's not the motto. I think the motto is our whole school for Christ, but the... but they don't talk about that. They like lifting as we climb, and I like it too. So it mattered that I came back to Ford after spending a little time at Princeton, not quite 3 years, and I have to say that the person who had the job that I tried to do, not nearly half as well as Ruth, was Ruth Simmons. I was her successor, interestingly enough. And people were very generous to me because she was legendary by the time I got there. Anyway, the point I want to make is my ability to be a risk taker. And I want to say that institution builders have to be change agents and risk takers. And I know I'm sitting next to one of the most courageous risk takers in the Ivy League. But what's really important here is that my ability to do that rested on the fact that I had a boss, because I was not the leader, as Ruth is, who was open to creativity and risk-taking in her senior management. And I don't know that I would have been able to do half the things had I not have someone like that.
Ruth?
I love what Allison said about kind of leading from the margins. But I think, I very early on in my career, I had to wrestle with the fact that I was so different and naturally marginalized, always. I think I said, I gave the Phi Beta Kappa address at Harvard and described the moment that I realized that wherever I went and whatever I did, I would always have to justify myself, that was going to be my life, and I was never going to be able to escape it. And therefore, it seemed to me to take charge of that, to in a sense, accept the fact that that is the way my life would be lived, that I could let go of trying to prove myself to people, because I would have an extraordinarily difficult job to do with everybody that I met. So I decided to let go of that. And so I remember that I wanted to leave a mark for all the people who were marginalized by fighting the very idea that people, because they are different, are less. So I just started to express ideas about what, not what was wrong, but what institutions needed to be. And I wanted to give voice to that. That was very important to me. So I gradually found myself doing that. So I remember when Princeton came to me and asked me to direct Afro-American Studies. And so my first comment was, why are you asking me to do that? And demanding an answer to it. You're asking me to do it because I'm African American. I have no qualifications whatsoever to direct Afro-American Studies. My field is French. Do you understand what French is? And so I had to make that point. And it's always been important to make that point, because that's part of institutional change, is not to let that pass.
Yes.
And so I made that point, and then, of course, I directed Afro-American Studies and built the program. And similarly, I was very concerned about the lack of women in the sciences at Princeton. 0 women in math, 0 in physics, almost none in engineering. So I decided that I was going to take on this problem. And so I stayed up late one night working in Nassau Hall, and I wrote out a proposal. And it was a proposal arguing that if Princeton could build buildings and it could structure endowments for all manner of things, that it certainly should be able to endow this all-important question of putting women faculty in the classroom in front of students. So I wrote out this proposal. And I expected it to be, I was doing it for myself as much as for anything, but I expected it to be dismissed. And so I marched down to the president's office, and I'm just a lowly, I don't know what I was at that point, well, maybe an associate dean.
An associate dean.
And I marched down to the president's office, and I handed this proposal, and I said, this is my proposal for what Princeton's high priority should be in getting women into this university in these fields. And to my surprise, the answer was, okay, so go do it.
Which president was this?
This was Bill Bowen, under Bill and Neil. And so I thought, go do it. How would I do that? How would I start? But in any case, so we came up with a target of opportunity program and opened up the competition for departments to bring women in. And then the math department, which had no women and no women's restrooms in the building, came in and asked for 6 positions for mathematics. And I gave them all the positions. And that's how we broke the bar in math at Princeton, is just by daring them to find women in mathematics and to go after them. And so we gave them a hunting license. And so it's that kind of thing that I thought, I didn't really think that would be accepted, frankly, at all. I did the same thing. I remember when I said to Neil, Toni Morrison should be recruited to Princeton. And thinking that he'd say, well, it's complicated. And he said, okay, we'll go do it. And some of it was a dare, to be sure. But I love to have a dare, because operating from the margin, you have the great advantage of surprising people all the time. And that's terrific. So somehow I think women, I'd love to say that is no longer present, but I know that would be a lie, and I wouldn't dare say that. There have been moments in my presidency at Brown where I've heard the same things that I heard early in my career, where I've heard resistance to women doing certain kinds of things, and whether they have the capacity to lead on the same basis as men. I've heard people make references to tenure cases in which women are doing odd kind of research that pales in comparison with the great work that men are doing. So these things are still with us. And therefore, it's very exciting to be in a position to still do this work. It's a crusade, and that is to make it possible for people to be considered for what they bring and for who they are, and not measured falsely against a standard that really is not the standard we should be looking at.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
I want to give an example of leading from the margin, and also a complicated, well, actually, 2, I'll mention them briefly. At the Ford Foundation, there was no foundation more engaged in working on issues of human rights than Ford. I mean, we were the sort of principal funders of Human Rights Watch. It is sort of in the DNA of the Ford Foundation to be a human rights organization. I say that because to this day, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have not funded human rights. They fund many other wonderful things, but they're not in that agenda. Well, the human rights establishment in the late 80s and early 90s was not interested in women's rights. And the idea that women's rights were human rights, because human rights were political rights, not necessarily the rights related to women as human beings, was really astonishing. And we had staff members who regarded themselves as really, on the forefront of important and good causes, who resisted the whole notion of women's rights as human rights. And that was a very long and complicated battle because the establishment at Ford at that time was uncomfortable because the grantees were uncomfortable. And in fact, grantees and staff all over the developing world attacked that whole notion as being Western imposed. The way it changed was to fund the women's rights groups in situ, in the indigenous communities, so that it wasn't a bunch of feminists coming from New York imposing this agenda, but in fact supporting people who were fighting. And instead of a top-down, Human Rights Watch finally decided it was going to pay attention to women's rights, it was a bottom-up. And I actually think a lot of the transforming of institutions has to occur as much from the bottom as from the top.
When you look back at the projects, great and small, that you've taken on, what were some of the moments that revealed the paradoxical challenges and unanticipated consequences of institution building with wider goals? So here, what I want you to do is think about particular projects that you've taken on, and the paradoxical quality of the challenges. So you can't just engage it with a linear solution because of those paradoxical qualities, but also that there are always going to be unanticipated consequences of institutional building, some of which you would argue one might take advantage of, right? The leading from the margins says that you don't feel defeated because you've got different viewpoints. You've got, in other words, it's just not a head-on collision. It's more complicated than that. But would you think of particular examples or particular moments?
Well, I think, in my own circumstance, I would say that perhaps others are better suited to describe this than I, but I certainly had the sense that there were particular expectations of me as an African American and as a woman. And that trying to navigate that and bring in a breadth and complexity when sometimes people were not ready for that has been a part of my task as a leader for some time. And when I first started at Brown, and I was asked the question of what are the most important things that Brown needs to do in the very near term. And I came up with a set of things that I thought were very important to do. First, to greatly expand the faculty, to support the graduate school at a higher level, to go need blind, and of course many other things that became the core of the plan for academic enrichment. The first thing I had to do was to persuade the corporation, for example, that that Brown really needed to do these things, because anytime you talk about change, there's always the implied suggestion that something is wrong. And so people first react to the notion that you're criticizing the institution. And that you really have to deal with, because that can poison any plans if you proceed from a position of disrespect. And because I've been at the margins all my life, and I understand disrespect, I knew it was important to focus on that, because this was a broad agenda, and it could very well be derailed by a sense that rather than supporting Brown, I was criticizing Brown. Mm-hmm. And there were some who were angry at some of the things that I said that needed to be done. At the same time, you can't have a very ambitious program without saying that something needs to change. And so that was a very delicate time, I think, at the very beginning. And many people here were involved in that. Karen was, Nancy was, others, Marie was. And so it was very delicate. But what I had the good fortune to have allies who were intelligent and who understood the need for change and who assisted me. And that's the other thing about broad institutional change, is that nobody is good enough to do that alone. And so somehow you have to bring people together in an enterprise that is so exciting to everybody, where many people have a role, and engage them so thoroughly that they take ownership of it and help you move change through the institution. So the PAE is a result of many, many, many people being involved and moving it through. But at the same time, I think that the novelty of my leadership at the beginning probably both was challenging, but at the same time probably helped. Mm-hmm. Because I think there was enough goodwill to help me that somehow the plan came into being, it got developed, the corporation supported it, and now, of course, we've done a lot of things that we set out to do. But there's no one way to do this, as you well know. There's so many factors that you cannot quantify. You can't quantify the connection that you make with people. You can't quantify whether or not people will feel inspired enough to follow. You can't quantify whether or not your ideas are actually good enough for X number of people to sign on to them. It's an elixir of sorts that you can't really always mix in exactly the same way. So what I've relied on in my time is just a basic, authentic approach to people, coming from a deep well of experience. And what I promised myself I'd never do is apologize for that experience. I know what I know. I've done what I've done. I was born what I was born, and I always wanted to bring all of that to what I do, because seeing all of that, people have a chance to understand your leadership more fully, and then you can establish trust, and people can understand what you're all about, because you make terrible mistakes when you do these jobs. And the question is always not whether you'll make mistakes, but whether or not a community has the wherewithal to forgive you for the terrible mistakes that you make. That's the only way a leader can survive, by having the trust of a community to do just that, to extend the hand when there's difficulty, or to forgive you when you do something that is not good.
A lot of wisdom over there.
So a lot of wisdom.
Let me just say that when Kay said, I want you to come and talk about being an institution builder, I thought, no, I'm not an institution builder. I've always seen myself as a change agent. And what's interesting about that to me is that institution builders have to be change agents. And Ruth just described that. I mean, to my way of thinking, institution builders understand that institutions are constantly changing. And what they're trying to do is balance the sort of aspiration and values that make that institution the institution it is, but much more important, the institution it hopes to be or can be. I mean, we used to have a joke at the Ford Foundation. I mean, Ford is a quite remarkable institution. Ruth is was on the board of Carnegie, so I'm not trying to knock Carnegie at all. But Ford, I mean, probably was and is the foundation that brought you most of the most important organizations working in civil rights. From the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund to the Native American Rights Fund to immigrant rights organizations, the Center for Constitutional Rights. I could go on and on and on. Henry Ford probably is turning over in his grave as we speak. That being said, to his credit, and he was an institution builder. He also built cars, but we'll leave that aside for a minute. He said that Ford should be founded, and we are celebrating, its 75th anniversary this year, Ford should be an instrument for the general welfare. Well, that is wide enough to interpret in every next generation what the general welfare is. So an institution builder, in my mind, also has to be a change agent. Also, I thought about this. There are 4 C's for institution builders. The first, change agent. The second one is consolidator. Because at the end of the day, you can't live constantly with change. You have to take that change and consolidate it. So that's second. And I think the best times when I've felt like I've had agency or personal efficacy is when I was really balancing change and consolidation. The third, and Ruth spoke to this, is a consensus builder. It isn't really, at the end of the day, your vision. It's when you can help others, and I think you said this. And last but not least, and you used the word, and this leads me to the story about how I got the title. The title, Knowledge, Creativity, and Free Expression, was to cover all of the different things that the unit at Ford, which I had responsibility for, did. Education, both higher and K-12, arts and culture, media, religion, and sexuality. And interestingly enough, we were trying to figure out what were the words that would combine all of that, and we had a joint activity at which I kept throwing out different words and so on. Freedom of expression, not just in print, but in terms of bodily integrity. That's how we got, in fact, to sexuality. Arts and culture, freedom of expression, certainly. So we came up with this great name, knowledge, freedom of expression, and creativity. And somebody jumped up and said, that's KCF, it's a chicken company. What are you going to do? So we flipped creativity and free expression, and we called ourselves KCF, not KFC.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
Well, this was, if you thought it was difficult for Dillard, this was like, you know, really bad in my family. Because my family was a very Southern Baptist family. And when I grew up, we couldn't dance, and we couldn't drink, of course. Very, very strict. That's how strict it was. So the idea that I was not going to church was just horrible. So, you know, for a long time, after I went off to college, you know, my father and I really, my mother had died by then, she died when I was 15, but my father and I, he just thought I was lost. And in fact, he told me so, that I would just, it was tragic to him that I was just never going to be able to become anything much, because I was not religious enough for him. You know, I was an outsider in my family for a time because I had these weird ideas. I was an outsider at my college because I had these weird ideas. I was just too different. And so in a way, it was quite lovely because I was forced to find my way. And thanks to literature, you know, I managed to do that by entering this different world. And that world was, you know, very instructive for me because it was so different from the world that I grew up in. And so that was the beginning for me, frankly, going off to Mexico and studying in Mexico, and then to France and so forth. So as you know, as he got older, and I think when I got my really, at some point, my father acknowledged that I had done okay. But for a long time he thought it was, you know, I was lost, frankly. Yeah. And probably many people today think I'm lost. Many of my friends think I'm lost. But.
I want to just add a footnote to this. I had the absolutely opposite experience. My father was an atheist, had abandoned all forms of religion, and was horrified when I went to college and said, you know, I know nothing of the Bible, I'm going to take a course. He was ready to not pay tuition. He was so upset.
question over there, yes.
Let me start just by saying what a pleasure it is to be back in academia. I mean, I'm very grateful to Spelman College to help ease my transition back into the academy. I have at least three concerns about the academy. I have more than three, but I'm going to raise three. One is that I do believe the whole question of the transfer of responsibility from society to individual students and their families in terms of the cost of higher education and who bears it has been a sea change that has not been really acknowledged or looked at carefully. Right now, in a place like Rutgers, students are graduating, and I'm sure this is true at Brown too, with the kind of debt that will condition their choices in ways that worry me a great deal, as a matter of fact. So I think the whole arena of access and financial aid, you know, people keep talking about the cost of college and universities, which is serious. But the government, in my opinion, has not really stepped up to the plate. It's one thing to have Pell Grants, it's another to have subsidized loans, which, to my way of thinking, does not solve the problem, and it passes the burden on to individual families rather than a joint societal thing. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I do think we've also hit a plateau in terms of diversity in higher education. Not only with regard to issues of gender, but certainly with regard to issues of race and ethnicity. The numbers of people of color on faculties have not changed substantially, especially among African Americans and Latinos, for decades. And I think we really have to be paying attention to that. And last but not least, I'm encouraged that institutions such as my own, such as Brown, are fighting the good fight for liberal arts. But I think it's an increasingly uphill struggle. And it's because people are feeling the financial crunch so dramatically. Those would be the three for me.
I agree. I completely disagree. If you think that in our time that being a disruptor was easy, you don't understand what it was like. It was mean. It was a very mean world. And so I think the thing to remember, here's what's finally struck me at some point, and it actually allowed me to become, to be president of Brown, because without this knowledge, I couldn't have taken the job, and I certainly wouldn't have been able to do well in it. But here's the big secret that people never tell you, and that is that leadership is really what people are desperately seeking. And sometimes they don't know that they are. Sometimes they don't know that they want disruption. If you are involved in searches at all, you know that when people are searching for leaders, the last thing in the world they want is a compliant person, because they know with that they get no leadership at all. So what they're actually looking for, they're looking for that spark of courage, of innovation, of creativity, and where we often fail as women. I mean, I give this lecture to women all the time. Women who come into my office and I say, well, tell me now, what are your thoughts and what do you need? And you know what they say, for the most part? Not Kay, but what they say for the most part is, oh, I'm just happy to be here, okay? There is a sense among many that in order to warrant remaining, to be a part of a community, you have to be compliant. But if you are compliant, that is really the worst thing that you can do, because you become undifferentiated and you become further marginalized and further dismissed, because you're not bringing all of what you offer to the institution. And what institutions crave more than anything is all of what you have to give. All of what you have to give. Your energy, your complete energy. Your analysis of what works and what doesn't work. So the mistake that I made was writing that white paper and thinking that I was going to march into the president's office and he was going to say, oh, here you are again, go away. I was wrong about that. So what he said instead was, okay, let's go do it. That's what people crave. So I would say in this environment, more than ever, the need to think hard about ways of bringing improvements is probably more important than ever. And I know when I'm hiring somebody, even especially in this environment, I'm looking for that more than ever. So I would encourage you to think in terms of what you can do that, as they say, adds value. Okay, it doesn't add a lot of value to just imitate what's already there. Okay, and it's going to be difficult. There's no question about that. Everybody who decides to break off in a new direction and to pursue a new field, for example, is taking a risk because there will be people who do not understand what you're trying to do. And if you offer a different perspective, there will be people who don't understand it and who dismiss it. And I remember when I first got to Brown, I had a wonderful person come to see me. A string of people came in to meet with me to tell me what I needed to do as president of Brown. And by the way, the first people who did that were my brothers and sisters who absolutely know nothing about running a university. But they told me everything I needed to do at Brown. But this very nice gentleman came in and said, I want to talk to you about this diversity situation at Brown. And then he went on and said, we don't need to be known as Diversity University. That's what people think of Brown. You've got to do something about this. And then I thought, as he was talking, I thought, what does he see in me? That he thinks that he can say this to me, It was really quite startling to me that he said that. But that's what you have to face all the time. I can't tell you what it was like to go through slavery and justice, not just at Brown, but throughout the country. That's just what comes with. That's what comes with leadership. People are testing you at every turn and looking to see what you do as a consequence of the challenges that they present. And you have to be up to the challenge. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to survive in what is often a very tough environment. This is not a career for the faint of heart, I would say.
I want to share an anecdote. When I was an undergraduate, I got a chance to go work in a congressman's office, and the person I had the really honor to work for was Morris Udall, who one of my heroes. And he was a great environmentalist, but he went to a meeting, I think it was the Sierra Club, and he said that the environmental movement needed fewer unloving critics and more loving critics, okay? And what he meant by that was that if you love an institution, you have to say to yourself, how can I make this institution better? Whether it's a social movement or Brown University or whatever. And I think it's really important, if you're interested in the changing quality of institutions. And I guess I used to think of myself as somebody who really didn't care about institutions, but I stayed at the Ford Foundation 14 years. Mm-hmm. There was something about that institution that I wanted to honor and protect, but also change. And you have to be willing to be critical as you love it. And that's not easy. Most people will either be unloving critics or, critical lovers. I want to be on the critical lover side.
Could I just add an addendum to that? Because I also think that You know, I grew up in in a hateful place, and I think because of that, in some ways I'm almost grateful for that, because I know how to deal with people who come in and say, you know, hateful things. So if you were to visit my house today, you'd see that this very person who came in to see me I have his picture on my desk because we became friends. Because the great thing about institutions and communities is that we're all educating each other. And the fact that somebody says, well, that's a perfectly lousy idea, is always an invitation to exchange ideas and to try to demonstrate in compelling ways why people may be wrong. And so he became my project, and a successful project. So I think, and I would also say that the best experiences I've had probably arise from people who have been in opposition to me at some point. Because it's fine to meet people who are completely in agreement with our view of change, but to meet people who are in absolute opposition to how we see the world, and to have an opportunity to work with them and to see whether we can learn from them and they can learn from us, is another level of endeavor, I have to say. And so I'll always remember those people. It reminds me of a young woman in a philosophy class when I was an undergraduate. I spent a year at Wellesley. And there was a young white South African in my class, and we were talking about apartheid. And I always tell students this story of being in this class and being absolutely an advocate for abolishing apartheid and very active in that. And at the same time, in this philosophy class, there's the white South African student who is advocating in favor of apartheid. And what I like to remind students is that I remember that student as if it was yesterday when I saw her, and I remember what she said. But I don't remember any of the other students in the class. So we do learn from the juxtaposition of these ideas and ideologies. And I try to remember as a university president that that's what this enterprise is all about. So I have to be faithful to that myself if I want the university to thrive, and to symbolize that myself. I have to embrace the idea of engaging with people who have views that are very much opposed to us. So in terms of changing an institution, you have to do that. There is no way to get there if you assemble a group of like-minded people and you want to force change because you have a critical group of like-minded people. It will never be enough to change an institution. You have to have the rest of the community members who disagree come along to some extent.
That is a great. I want to thank Ruth and Allison for a fabulous conversation, and thank all of you for helping us celebrate the Pembroke Center's 30th anniversary. We continue all day tomorrow. If you want to join us, starting at 9 o'clock, there with panels, open conference discussions. We have a party in the afternoon, so if you just want to come to the party, come mid-afternoon. We'll have good food and drinks, but I would suggest you try things a little earlier. But you're certainly all welcome, and I'm just very grateful that we were all here together tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great to be with you.
Same here. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Did you do this somewhere before?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we should take it on the road. Maybe
That's all right.
I know. We should take it on the road.